January 1942. A bitter wind cuts across Newark, New Jersey, seeping through the factory windows. Inside, the hum of machines fills the air. Conveyor belts clatter, metal instruments gleam under harsh overhead lights, and workers in white coats move with urgent precision. Sterile gauze, surgical scissors, antiseptic jars. Every item represents a life that could be saved thousands of miles away. Across the country, in army hospitals and makeshift medical tents, the reality is harsher. Nurses stitch wounds with frayed bandages. Doctors improvise with limited antiseptics. The front lines in Europe and the Pacific are taking a toll, and every missing supply could cost a soldier his life. In the midst of this scarcity, one company, Johnson & Johnson, faces a daunting challenge: transform its peacetime operations into a wartime production powerhouse. Factories that once made medical kits for civilians now scramble to meet demands the scale of which the company has never seen. Machines whirl. Workers sweat. Every second matters. Outside, the war rages, but inside these walls, the battle for sterile supplies is just beginning. One that will determine who lives and who dies in the months ahead. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, America had not fully grasped the scale of war that was unfolding across the globe. In 1941, the U.S. military numbered just over 1 million men, scattered across bases in the continental United States, Alaska, and scattered territories. Its medical infrastructure was adequate for peacetime operations, but ill-prepared for the demands of a worldwide conflict. Hospitals were stocked for minor emergencies. Bandages and antiseptics were plentiful for civilian care, but nowhere near enough to sustain millions of troops facing combat wounds, tropical diseases, and battlefield infections. Johnson & Johnson, headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey, was already a recognized name in medical care. Its catalog of products, surgical dressings, sterile sutures, baby powders, serve hospitals and homes alike. Yet its factories, designed for moderate civilian demand, operated on schedules that could not meet the sudden, enormous needs of a nation at war. In the early months of 1942, as the United States mobilized, military medical officers toured supply depots and hospitals with growing concern. Reports arrived daily. Bandages were running low, sterile gauze shipments delayed, surgical instruments insufficient for the number of casualties being projected. The Army Medical Department issued urgent memoranda in January 1942. One report noted that field hospitals would face critical shortages of sterile supplies within weeks unless immediate action is taken. Across the country, warehouses of pre-war surplus could not compensate. Factories had to be retooled. Workers had to be retrained. Every product, every roll of gauze, every jar of iodine, every pair of surgical scissors had to pass stringent sterilization standards to ensure they would not do more harm than good in the hands of surgeons on the front lines. Johnson & Johnson responded quickly. Factory managers convened in January, mapping out a plan to scale production tenfold. Assembly lines had to run around the clock. Autoclaves, which sterilized instruments using high-pressure steam, were upgraded or duplicated. Packaging methods were redesigned to maintain sterility for longer periods. Engineers calculated airflow, humidity, and temperature, recognizing that even small deviations could ruin entire batches. The pressure was immense. Failure was not an option. Thousands of lives depended on these decisions. By February, the federal government began coordinating directly with private manufacturers. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, issued guidelines prioritizing contracts for medical supplies. Johnson & Johnson's plants were identified as critical infrastructure, granting them access to scarce raw materials like cotton for gauze and metal for instruments. Despite these advantages, bottlenecks were constant. Rail shipments were delayed, raw materials diverted, and labor shortages intensified as young men enlisted and joined the armed forces. Women, older workers, and those previously excluded from industrial roles were recruited in mass, bringing skill and determination, but also requiring rapid training in sterile handling procedures. Even as the factories roared to life, the human stakes remained clear. Soldiers in North Africa and the Pacific were already encountering infections that could have been prevented with proper sterile care. A minor wound could escalate into gangrene. Hospital records from early 1942 show that in some forward units, bandages were washed and reused, sterilization improvised with boiling water. Commanding officers warned that the shortage of medical supplies was as dangerous as enemy fire. This urgency created a sense of purpose within Johnson & Johnson that transcended profit margins or quotas. The company understood that its role was pivotal, not just for the war effort, but for human survival itself. By March 1942, production plans were fully underway. Assembly lines expanded, shifts multiplied, and sterilization protocols became rigorous to meet Army standards. The company began testing new methods of batch sterilization to increase output without compromising quality. Every decision, how many instruments could fit into an autoclave, how quickly gauze could be rolled and packaged, how jars of antiseptics could be sealed and transported, carried weighty consequences. Outside the factories, the war continued to escalate, making the stakes even higher. The stage was now set. A nation facing critical shortages, soldiers at risk, and a company on the brink of transforming its operations. From this pressure cooker of scarcity and necessity, innovation would emerge, not the kind born of research alone, but of immediate survival. Johnson & Johnson's efforts would not only supply the military, but redefine industrial medical production for decades to come. The urgency in the factories and the stark need at the front lines naturally leads into the second part of the context, how these shortages manifested across hospitals and battlefronts, and the government's intensified call for industrial mobilization. By mid-1942, the shortage of medical supplies in America had reached a critical stage. Field hospitals along the Atlantic and Pacific theaters reported that bandages, sterile dressings, and surgical instruments were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. In North Africa, medics working under blistering sun and sand-strewn tents wrote in official logs that infections from minor wounds were claiming more lives than anticipated. In the Pacific Islands, tropical diseases compounded the threat, and the lack of antiseptics made even routine surgeries a gamble. Back home, hospitals in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco faced rationing. Nurses were instructed to reuse dressings when absolutely necessary. Supply rooms were stripped bare as civilian needs competed with military demands. Government inspectors toured facilities, their reports stark. Unless production increases dramatically, soldiers will arrive at the front without the most basic sterile supplies. The urgency was amplified by the scale of American mobilization. By July 1942, over 2 million men were in uniform, with millions more in training. Each recruit, each battalion, required a continuous stream of sterile bandages, sutures, and medical kits. Johnson & Johnson, now fully aware of the magnitude of the crisis, accelerated its operations. Factory floors that once hummed with moderate activity now roared with near-constant motion. Conveyor belts moved with military precision, carrying rows of gauze, surgical kits, and antiseptics. Workers, many women and older employees who had not previously handled industrial medical production, were trained in sterile techniques and quality control. Autoclaves, massive, pressure-sealed sterilizers, worked in shifts around the clock, each cycle a race against time to deliver usable supplies. Engineers constantly monitored temperature, steam pressure, and packaging integrity. A single lapse could render an entire batch unsafe. Government coordination intensified. The War Production Board assigned raw materials directly to essential manufacturers. Cotton for gauze, metal for instruments, and glass for antiseptic jars became controlled commodities, distributed under strict priority. Johnson & Johnson was now operating under a war contract, and its factories were deemed critical infrastructure. This status brought resources, but also immense pressure. Failure was no longer a corporate concern. It was a national one. The company's production schedule was now inseparable from the survival of American soldiers overseas. Logistics became a monumental challenge. Railroads, already congested with war material, struggled to transport finished medical supplies from New Jersey to ports for shipment abroad. Every delay threatened lives. Managers devised new strategies, pre-packing supplies for quick distribution, labeling kits for specific theaters of operation, and coordinating with military transportation officers to prioritize shipments. By late summer 1942, the factories were producing unprecedented quantities of sterile medical goods, but the demand continued to rise. For every 10 units produced, reports indicated 12 units were needed. The gap between supply and necessity was a daily reminder of the stakes. Amid these industrial efforts, the human cost of the shortages was unmistakable. Letters from medics on the front lines described improvised treatments, repeated infections, and the desperation of soldiers awaiting medical attention. Surgeons, trained to save lives, were forced to improvise with inadequate tools. Every missing bandage, every delayed shipment, became a story of potential loss. These reports filtered back to Johnson & Johnson executives, shaping their sense of mission. The factory floors were not just workplaces. They were front lines in an unseen, yet vital battle. By September 1942, the first large-scale shipments of sterile medical supplies began leaving New Jersey for deployment overseas. Gauze rolls, surgical kits, antiseptics, and sutures were packed in crates, labeled by theater, and loaded onto ships bound for Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. The company's rapid expansion, its strict adherence to sterilization protocols, and its logistical coordination marked a turning point. No longer was Johnson & Johnson a peacetime medical supplier. It had become an industrial lifeline for the U.S. military. The shortages, the urgency, and the innovations in production set the stage for examining the story from multiple angles. The human experience on the front lines, the technological ingenuity in factories, the leadership challenges in coordinating labor and logistics, and a moral imperative to deliver supplies where they were most desperately needed. Each angle reveals a different facet of this complex struggle, highlighting the enormous effort required to bridge the gap between scarcity and survival. The war did not pause for logistics. In 1942, soldiers bleeding from shrapnel in North Africa or jungle infections in the Solomon Islands often faced the cruel reality that supplies were scarce. Medics, carrying packs of limited bandages and sterile gauze, improvised constantly. One diary entry from a field hospital notes, "We have 6 bandages for 12 men. Every cut, every abrasion is a gamble." The psychological toll was immense. Wounded soldiers feared infection as much as enemy fire. For medics, the frustration of knowing help existed somewhere, but not at hand, was agonizing. Each delayed supply shipment could mean the difference between life and death. Back in the United States, nurses and civilian hospital staff confronted similar pressures. Civilian casualties from accidents, childbirth, and disease had to be treated alongside military demands. Nurses described long nights, sterilizing instruments manually, boiling metal trays over open flames when autoclaves were fully occupied. The human cost of supply scarcity was measured not only in numbers, but in the exhaustion, anxiety, and unrelenting responsibility felt by those who worked with what little they had. This urgency, this human strain, fueled an unspoken but relentless motivation. Survival depended on ingenuity, speed, and precision. The sudden wartime demand forced Johnson & Johnson to rethink its manufacturing at molecular level. Sterile production was not merely scaling. It required re-engineering. Factories designed for moderate civilian needs had to transform into continuous, industrialized operations producing millions of units under strict sterilization standards. Autoclaves became the heartbeat of the operation. Massive cylinders of steel capable of heating surgical instruments, sutures, and bandages to precise temperatures and pressures for extended cycles. Every cycle had to be meticulously monitored. Too short, and instruments could harbor bacteria. Too long, and raw materials risked degradation. Packaging also became a technological challenge. Sterile products had to remain uncontaminated during transport, often across oceans, under variable temperatures and humidity. Engineers devised new sealing techniques, labeling protocols, and handling procedures to ensure that what left the factory would remain safe until it reached the field hospital. Conveyor belts moved faster. Machines were adapted to wrap gauze efficiently without compromising sterility, and quality control teams multiplied. Even minor mechanical failures could have catastrophic effects, so predictive maintenance and precise calibration became essential. This era marked a significant step in industrial medical technology. Sterile production at scale, under conditions of unprecedented urgency. Scaling sterile production in wartime America was as much about leadership as technology. Johnson & Johnson executives, engineers, and factory managers had to make rapid decisions under immense pressure, balancing speed with quality. Labor shortages, raw material scarcity, and government directives added layers of complexity. One plant manager recalled the challenge. Every decision mattered. A mistake wasn't just costly, it could end a life overseas. Leadership was tested on every level, from organizing shifts that ran around the clock, to retraining women and older workers in sterile handling, to implementing rigorous quality inspections to meet Army standards. Meanwhile, coordination with the federal government required diplomacy and adaptability. The War Production Board prioritized shipments and raw materials, but delays and bureaucratic bottlenecks demanded constant attention. Leaders at Johnson & Johnson had to anticipate shortages, adjust production schedules, and ensure that critical supplies reached ports on time. Failure in any link of this chain could jeopardize entire military operations. The company's leadership was not simply about managing a factory. It was about orchestrating a lifeline that connected thousands of civilian workers in New Jersey with soldiers thousands of miles away. These three perspectives, the human experience of scarcity, the technological challenge of scaling sterile production, and the leadership required to manage people and processes, reveal the magnitude of the problem and the ingenuity it inspired. Soldiers' lives hung on gauze rolls and antiseptic jars. Engineers solved unprecedented industrial challenges. Executives navigated complex logistics under the pressure of war. Each angle underscores that the effort to supply sterile medical equipment was not merely a business challenge. It was a moral and national imperative. In war, logistics can determine victory as decisively as firepower. In 1942, the flow of sterile medical supplies became a tactical concern. Commanders in the Pacific and North African theaters knew that even minor delays could disrupt field hospital operations. One North African field hospital report noted, "Without sufficient bandages, the wounded must be moved farther back, risking infection during transport." Every shipment leaving a factory in New Jersey was part of a complex chain. Trucks carried crates to rail depots. Trains moved them to coastal ports, and ships braved U-boat-infested waters to reach distant battlefronts. Johnson & Johnson's scaling efforts directly influenced battlefield tactics. Units could plan operations knowing that medical support would be available, enabling more aggressive engagement without the fear of unmanageable casualties. Medics could carry sufficient field kits. Hospitals could perform surgeries quickly, and soldiers had a higher survival probability if wounded. The company's industrial efficiency became an unseen tactical advantage, demonstrating that in modern warfare, industrial production was inseparable from military strategy. Supply chains were not just logistics, they were an extension of combat capability itself. The scarcity of medical supplies posed profound ethical questions. Nurses and medics were forced to ration sterile items, deciding which wounds received fresh bandages and which had to be improvised. These decisions were not abstract, they were life-or-death judgments. In letters from Pacific medics, the tension is palpable. We patch as best we can, but I fear that every reused dressing shortens the chance for recovery. For Johnson & Johnson, the ethical dimension of production was equally pressing. Executives knew that every delay, every batch compromised by error, could result in a soldier's death. Quality control was not a bureaucratic requirement. It was a moral imperative. Workers on the assembly line understood that the precision of their labor, the speed at which they maintained sterility, had direct consequences for lives thousands of miles away. The pressure forged a culture of responsibility and urgency unlike any peacetime operation, where profit margins were replaced by ethical stakes and the human cost of every decision was tangible. The ripple effects of medical supply availability extended to the broader strategic landscape. In early 1942, inadequate supplies meant slower recovery for wounded soldiers, reducing the number of troops available for sustained operations. Units weakened by untreated injuries or infections were less effective against Axis forces. The Japanese advance in the Pacific and German operations in North Africa highlighted how even small medical inefficiencies could influence operational tempo. Conversely, the scaling of sterile production by Johnson & Johnson created a strategic advantage. Once shipments began arriving consistently, frontline units could recuperate faster, maintain higher operational readiness, and engage the enemy with renewed strength. Commanders noted improved morale among troops who knew that injuries could be treated effectively. The industrial solution on the home front became a silent weapon, amplifying the effectiveness of trained soldiers on distant battlefields. In a war where every edge mattered, medical supply chains became as critical as artillery or armor. These perspectives illuminate the multifaceted impact of the medical supply crisis in 1942. Human resilience, industrial ingenuity, ethical responsibility, and strategic foresight converged to meet a challenge that could have crippled the U.S. military effort. Soldiers' lives, tactical effectiveness, and even the pace of battles were directly tied to the ability of factories in New Jersey to churn out sterile instruments, gauze, and antiseptics. By late 1942, the pace inside Johnson & Johnson's factories had reached a fever pitch. Assembly lines stretched across miles of floor space, workers moving in synchronized precision. The roar of autoclaves, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic clatter of machinery. It was a symphony of urgency, each note echoing the stakes of lives waiting thousands of miles away. For months, the company had labored to meet quotas that seemed almost impossible. Millions of sterile bandages, surgical kits, and antiseptic jars needed each month. Now, that effort was finally bearing fruit. In November, the first massive shipments began leaving New Jersey ports bound for North Africa. Crates marked with theater designations were loaded onto freighters, their holds stuffed with gauze, sutures, and antiseptic bottles. Dock workers, aware of the war's stakes, moved with uncommon diligence. Each shipment represented not just supplies, but the potential to save thousands of lives in the upcoming campaigns against Axis forces. Military logisticians coordinated with the factory to ensure that these precious shipments would arrive intact, unspoiled by the long voyage or tropical humidity. At the front lines, the impact was immediate. Field hospitals received supplies that had been scarce for months. Medics no longer had to reuse bandages or ration antiseptics. Surgeons could operate with confidence, knowing that sterile instruments were available for each patient. In North Africa, during the Tunisian campaign, reports from commanding officers highlighted the difference. Wounded soldiers receive care promptly. Recovery rates have improved, and units return to duty faster than ever before. The human toll of the previous month's shortages was being reversed. Inside the factories, innovation continued even as production surged. Engineers devised automated wrapping systems that increased throughput without compromising sterility. New labeling protocols reduced errors in shipping, ensuring that supplies reached the correct theater. Each adjustment, each improvement compounded the overall effect on the war effort. For the first time, the synergy between industrial production and frontline necessity was fully realized. Johnson & Johnson was no longer merely meeting demand. It was shaping the operational effectiveness of the U.S. military. The leadership challenges that had defined earlier months now showed their dividends. Factory managers had optimized shifts, coordinated labor, and instituted rigorous quality checks. Workers, trained in sterile procedures and motivated by the knowledge of lives, depending on their precision, maintained extraordinary standards. Reports from supervisors frequently emphasized the morale boost of seeing shipments leave the docks. Each crate a tangible victory against the shortages that had plagued hospitals just months before. By December 1942, the scale of production reached historic levels. Millions of sterile bandages, thousands of surgical instruments, and tens of thousands of antiseptic bottles were dispatched monthly. The American war machine, previously hampered by logistical and medical deficiencies, now had a steady lifeline. Commanders could plan operations with the knowledge that medical support would be reliable. Troop morale improved as soldiers realized that injuries would be treated effectively and promptly. Even minor details carried significance. Gauze rolls were color-coded by size for rapid deployment. Surgical kits were pre-packed for specific types of wounds, and antiseptic bottles were sealed with tamper-proof caps to ensure sterility during long sea voyages. Each innovation, born of necessity, demonstrated that industrial efficiency was inseparable from military effectiveness. The line between factory floor and battlefield blurred, as the success of one dictated the survival of the other. This turning point was not just about numbers. It was about timing and execution. The months of preparation, innovation, and relentless effort culminated in a moment when sterile supplies began to flow at a scale that fundamentally altered battlefield conditions. Soldiers wounded in the Tunisian deserts, medics facing the unforgiving heat and sand, and surgeons performing critical operations, each experienced the direct consequences of industrial mastery. For the first time in 1942, the U.S. military could count on a reliable supply of sterile medical equipment, a lifeline that would sustain campaigns for the months to come. The success of these shipments marked a decisive moment. The scarcity that had threatened soldiers' lives was being replaced by unprecedented abundance. Factories in New Jersey had become instruments of war, and the meticulous planning, innovation, and human effort behind each shipment underscored the importance of Homefront contributions. The stage was now set to witness how these supplies changed the war in practice, accelerating recovery, enabling offensive operations, and transforming the relationship between industry and military strategy. January 1943. The shipments from Johnson & Johnson's factories were no longer sporadic. They were a lifeline flowing continuously to the front lines. In Tunisia, American field hospitals that had struggled for months now bristled with activity, fully stocked with sterile bandages, surgical kits, and antiseptics. Wounded soldiers were treated promptly, infections dropped, and recovery times shortened. Commanders noted an immediate operational effect. More troops could return to duty, maintaining unit strength for offensive maneuvers against German and Italian forces. One medic wrote in his field diary, "We no longer fight the clock or scarcity. Wounded men have hope. Our ability to heal them has been restored." This was more than morale, it was tactical advantage. In the unforgiving North African deserts, where heat, dust, and infection claimed lives as readily as bullets, access to sterile supplies meant soldiers who might have succumbed to sepsis were now surviving. Entire battalions remained combat-ready because medical teams could provide prompt, reliable care. Across the Pacific on islands like Guadalcanal and New Georgia, similar transformations were underway. Tropical wounds, often complicated by bacterial infections, could now be treated before they became life-threatening. Field hospitals, once overwhelmed by minor injuries, could now handle large numbers of casualties. Soldiers, reassured that treatment would be effective, fought with renewed determination. Reports from officers noted a striking difference. Our men recover faster and return to the fight in numbers previously impossible. Medical support is now a decisive factor. The logistics behind this success were staggering. Ships, escorted against submarine threats, carried crates of sterile supplies thousands of miles from the U.S. East Coast. Rail and truck convoys delivered supplies efficiently to embarkation points. Military quartermasters coordinated closely with factory managers to match supply to demand, ensuring that theaters of operation received exactly what was needed. The careful orchestration of industrial production, shipping, and frontline allocation became a defining feature of American strategy. On the factory floor, the human drama continued. Workers, aware of the lives depending on each roll of gauze or vial of antiseptic, pushed machinery to new limits. Shift managers implemented precise timing for sterilization cycles, while engineers monitored equipment to prevent contamination. Each success reinforced the moral and psychological stakes. Every sterile instrument was a soldier saved, every efficient shipment a small victory against the hardships of war. The battlefield consequences of this industrial achievement were clear. In Tunisia, American forces executed coordinated attacks that relied on sustained troop strength and medical support. Commanders could plan offensives knowing that injuries could be managed, unlike earlier in 1942 when manpower was depleted by preventable infections and untreated wounds. In the Pacific, jungle campaigns that demanded endurance and rapid casualty evacuation benefited directly from the availability of reliable medical kits. Soldiers were no longer hampered by fear of infection or lack of supplies. They could focus on mission objectives. Even small details mattered. Color-coded gauze and pre-packed surgical kits allowed medics to respond immediately to diverse injuries. Antiseptics preserved the health of patients during transport. Sterile instruments reduced surgical complications. Every advance that seemed minor in the factory translated into measurable gains in soldier survival rates and battlefield effectiveness. In essence, industrial efficiency became a force multiplier, demonstrating how Homefront innovation could directly influence combat outcomes. By mid-1943, the U.S. military was experiencing a profound shift. Units that had previously been limited by medical shortages now enjoyed consistent treatment capabilities. Recovery rates improved, troop morale increased, and commanders gained strategic flexibility. The success of Johnson & Johnson's scaled sterile production had become a turning point not only in military medicine, but in the broader conduct of the war. The efforts of thousands of factory workers, engineers, and executives were now reflected in the resilience and effectiveness of American soldiers on distant battlefields. By mid-1943, the impact of Johnson & Johnson's scaled sterile production was unmistakable. Field hospitals, once crippled by shortages, now operated at full capacity. Medical officers reported a sharp decline in infection-related fatalities among wounded soldiers. In North Africa, recovery rates for troops treated within 24 hours of injury increased by nearly 40%, according to Army Medical Department records. Wounds that might have previously become gangrenous were now treated swiftly and effectively, allowing soldiers to return to their units in weeks rather than months. The volume of supplies was staggering. By June 1943, Johnson & Johnson's factories were producing over 10 million sterile dressings per month, along with hundreds of thousands of surgical instruments and antiseptic bottles. Each crate leaving the New Jersey docks represented countless lives saved overseas. The industrial achievement was matched by logistical prowess. Rail lines, ports, and convoys worked in tandem to ensure that supplies reached their destinations intact. Military planners noted that the availability of reliable medical supplies allowed them to plan larger, more sustained operations, knowing that injured soldiers would receive prompt care. The human dimension of this impact was profound. Soldiers' letters and diaries frequently referenced the difference made by consistent, sterile medical care. One letter from a medic on the Solomon Islands described how new supplies gave us the ability to save men we would have lost before. We no longer improvise at the expense of their lives. Nurses at domestic hospitals echoed this sentiment, noting that rationing and improvisation had largely ended. The morale boost extended beyond the front lines. Families, commanders, and civilian staff all gained confidence in the military's capacity to protect its personnel. Johnson & Johnson's workforce shared in the victory. Employees, many of whom had never handled wartime production, took pride in their contribution. Factories operated in shifts around the clock, and teams celebrated milestones quietly but meaningfully. Each shipment a tangible result of labor, precision, and endurance. Engineers and managers documented innovations in sterilization techniques, packaging, and quality control, establishing procedures that would set standards for the remainder of the war and for decades afterward. Quantifiable outcomes also extended to military operations. In Tunisia, the improved medical support allowed for sustained offensives against entrenched German and Italian positions. Casualty replacement rates improved because soldiers recovered faster, maintaining unit strength. In the Pacific, field hospitals could respond to the increased number of wounded from amphibious assaults without overwhelming medical staff. Strategically, reliable medical supply transformed the operational calculus for commanders. They could plan more complex maneuvers, confident that medical contingencies were manageable. The success also influenced broader industrial policy. The War Production Board recognized the critical importance of civilian companies in sustaining military operations. Johnson & Johnson's rapid scaling demonstrated that private industry could meet unprecedented military demands when supported with resources, guidance, and national urgency. Lessons learned from sterilization protocols, quality control, and distribution networks were applied to other industries, including food preservation, ammunition, and vehicle production, creating a model of industrial mobilization that would define the American wartime economy. Amid the numbers and logistics, the human story remains central. Soldiers who survived wounds that once would have been fatal returned home to continue their service. Medics and nurses carried pride in the difference they had made. Factory workers understood that each sterile dressing, each surgical kit, was more than an object. It was a lifeline. The synthesis of human effort, technological innovation, and leadership created a ripple effect, turning scarcity into abundance and uncertainty into reliability. This immediate aftermath, the measurable improvements in recovery, operational readiness, and industrial capacity, naturally leads into Aftermath, Section 2, where we examine the longer-term consequences, shifts in military strategy the institutionalization of large-scale sterile production, and enduring lessons for both industry and medicine. By late 1943, the ripple effects of Johnson & Johnson's wartime production were evident across the U.S. military and beyond. Soldiers who might once have faced prolonged recovery or death from infection were returning to duty more rapidly. Commanders incorporated medical readiness into operational planning, confident that sterile supplies would support sustained campaigns. The previously hidden link between factory floors in New Jersey and battlefields in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific had become a strategic pillar. Medical logistics was no longer a secondary concern. It was central to the conduct of war. The institutional impact extended beyond immediate campaigns. The Army Medical Department formalized procedures for coordinating civilian industrial partners with military supply needs. Standardized packaging, labeling, and sterilization protocols, developed under wartime urgency, became permanent features of military medical logistics. Hospitals and field units now operated under systems that prioritized efficiency, sterility, and predictability. Lessons learned under the pressure of crisis, but codified for future conflicts. Johnson & Johnson itself continued to refine production techniques, documenting best practices in sterilization, quality assurance, and large-scale assembly line management. These protocols would influence post-war medical manufacturing for decades. Strategically, the war effort demonstrated the importance of home-front industrial capacity in shaping battlefield outcomes. While tanks, aircraft, and ammunition capture headlines, the quiet success of medical supply chains proved equally decisive. Reliable sterile supplies allowed U.S. forces to sustain prolonged operations, reduce preventable fatalities, and maintain morale in grueling conditions. Enemy forces, by contrast, often struggled with medical shortages, giving American units a hidden but critical advantage. Analysts in 1944 noted that units with adequate medical support had higher operational endurance, faster recovery, and improved overall effectiveness, a factor directly tied to industrial production back home. The human and moral dimensions endured as well. Soldiers returning from battle carried gratitude for the unseen workforce that had enabled their survival. Nurses and medics reflected on how the improvements in supply had transformed their daily labor, reducing improvisation and the psychological strain of scarcity. Factory workers, too, recognized the stakes of their work. In many cases, employee letters, company newsletters, and internal reports conveyed a shared sense of purpose. Each sterile dressing, each surgical instrument, represented a life preserved. The war had blurred the boundaries between civilian labor and military service, embedding a sense of responsibility that extended far beyond the factory gates. The success also shaped the post-war era. Johnson & Johnson's innovations in sterile production became a model for large-scale medical manufacturing, influencing hospitals, manufacturers, and government agencies alike. The wartime experience catalyzed advances in mass sterilization, quality control, and logistical coordination that continued to benefit both civilian and military medicine. Lessons learned about speed, precision, and human oversight were applied to other critical industries, from pharmaceuticals to emergency response equipment, leaving a legacy of preparedness born from necessity. Ultimately, the aftermath of 1942 to 1943 reveals a transformation at multiple levels. On the battlefield, medical shortages that had once threatened operations were reversed. In industry, civilian companies demonstrated their ability to respond with unprecedented speed and precision. In strategy, military leaders learned that logistics, including medical supply chains, could dictate outcomes as decisively as weapons or tactics. And in the human sphere, lives were saved, morale restored, and a culture of responsibility and innovation cemented. The victories in sterile production and medical logistics became an enduring testament to the interdependence of human effort technological innovation, and strategic vision, a quiet but decisive factor in America's wartime success. The story of 1942 is not told in the roar of guns or the sweep of tanks. It is told in the quiet precision of a factory floor in New Jersey. It is told in the hands of workers wrapping gauze, sterilizing instruments, and sealing antiseptic bottles, fully aware that their labor would reach soldiers on distant battlefields. In that moment, human ingenuity met necessity, and ordinary industry became extraordinary service. Johnson & Johnson's rapid scaling of sterile production demonstrated a truth that resonates beyond the war. Survival is as much about preparation, coordination, and dedication as it is about courage in battle. Each shipment, each roll of gauze, each vial of antiseptic became a lifeline, a tangible connection between the home front and the front lines. Soldiers could fight with confidence, medics could act without improvisation, and commanders could plan knowing that medical support would not fail them. The human cost of scarcity was transformed into a story of resilience and innovation. The legacy of this effort extends beyond numbers and reports. It reshaped industrial medicine, introduced new standards for sterilization and quality, and codified lessons in logistics and workforce coordination that would endure long after the war. But more profoundly, it illustrated the moral dimension of production, that the work of ordinary people, applied with precision and urgency, could save lives and shape history. In the end, the battle for sterile supplies reminds us that wars are won not only on the battlefield, but also in the silent corridors of factories, in the meticulous hours of labor, and in the unwavering commitment to human life. The story of 1942 is a testament to the power of ingenuity, responsibility, and coordination, a quiet, indispensable victory that changed the course of the war and set a precedent for generations to come.